Nintendo has been awarded the best developer from Famitsu magazine. Famitsu readers have voted Nintendo as the greatest video game developer in the industry, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. Okay, PlayStation's out. Xbox was never relevant in Japan. Japan is basically Nintendo country, and it's so culturally known at this point that even people like Nintendo don't try to deny it. Like, what they try to do instead is trying to say Japan doesn't matter and that it's a dying country and that, like, nobody plays games there anyway. I remember 10 years ago, the cope was supposed to be that, like, the mobile would take over and that, like, Nintendo would, like, lose their handheld division and they'd go out of business, and, like, the executives would be giving blowjobs behind buildings in Kanto or something. Like, the reality is, Nintendo has a monopoly in Japan, and they are in a process. They are in the process of extending that monopoly to the rest of the world. Whatever Nintendo has been trying to tell you in regards to, like, the global market and the sales numbers and, like, particularly the UK numbers, it's just a gigantic cope, because what we're seeing is that Nintendo is dominating Sony and Xbox in all regions, in all demographics, in all range ranges. The only people who still care about Xbox and PlayStation in 2026 are just, like, nostalgia blinded millennials who just refuse to move on from PlayStation or Xbox. Like, they just don't want to admit it's over. Like, they have spent the past 25 years trying to glaze, like, these companies, trying to say they were competitive, trying to say they were on par with or better than Nintendo. And the simple fact of the matter is that is not and never has been the case. And I've seen a lot of people, like, try and argue that, like, well, Sony beat N64 with the PS1, and that just isn't true, because you're not accounting for the Game Boy, right, the most popular video game console ever made, and you're not accounting for Pokemon, which went on to be the biggest brand ever, okay? Like, again, when you actually look at the big picture, when you look at, like, how Nintendo produced N64 games, like, outsold all of the major PS1 games and have gone on to be the most beloved games ever made and are still selling millions of units 30 years later. Like, what you see is that, like, Nintendo absolutely won that console generation. Like, all Sony did was gaslight a generation that traditionally did not play video games, dude bros, and those people carried their contempt for Nintendo for the next 20 years until they, like, started having kids themselves and picked out, like, Nintendo for, like, their first consoles. Like, again, what we've seen over the past decade is just the slow, gradual decline of the established narrative. Like, PlayStation just hasn't done enough to appease their traditional demographic of, like, 20-year-old dude bros who just hate Nintendo for being kiddie, who hate Japanese stuff, who hate, like, video games as a concept. Like, PlayStation sold itself on being, like, the trendy console that, like, normal people played. And at a certain point, that stopped being true. Like, Nintendo introduced games like Animal Crossing. They introduced games like Breath of the Wild. Like Mario. It became more socially acceptable to be a fan of Mario, right? It wasn't something that would get you laughed at anymore, right? You look at, like, what has been happening in the industry. You look at, like, how things have been changing, and you look at, like, the radical shift in the culture, and, like, what you come away with thinking is that, like, there wasn't really a shot for Sony to succeed to begin with, because when you really look at, like, Sony's history, like, they never really established themselves as, like, an actual brand. Like, their entire brand essentially revolved around this idea that they weren't Nintendo and that Nintendo sucked. Nintendo was for children. Nintendo wasn't as good as PlayStation. And slowly, over the next 20 years, like, people began to realize that wasn't true. It began with, like, the Pokemon thing, and then, like, the Wii revolution, and then, like, the Wii U established that, like, Nintendo developed first-party games were actually better than the competition. And then the Switch kind of, like, rendered PlayStation completely obsolete. And it's interesting that we're now at the point where it's pretty culturally recognize like just how Nintendo has been dominant in this industry for the past 20 years. The entire period of like pretending that the GameCube or the Wii U failed is like long behind us. Like the industry is even having problems like gaslighting people into thinking the N64 failed these days because too many people are still playing the console. Okay, nobody's playing PS1 anymore, but like the N64 is still perfectly relevant. Like what we're seeing is just like the entire house of cards just kind of collapse, and traditional situations, right, that they would do where they would just be like, oh, there aren't enough games, like there's nothing to play, I'm not interested in this or that. Like that doesn't fly in today's market, especially considering like all the backwards compatible like Switch 1 games that are available on Switch 2. Right? When you take that into consideration, it's like it's impossible to take the narrative that Nintendo is failing seriously. It's something that like absolutely has to get called out and something that like absolutely needs to be addressed. It's something that like I feel is just completely devoid of reality. Like right now, we're kind of in the early phases of like the Nintendians of the world just accepting that Nintendo has won the console generation. Like I don't think it's gonna happen until like we actually get like the new Xbox and PlayStation consoles and we see what a disaster they are. But I think like the mere announcement that the PS6 isn't gonna come with a disc drive, I think that in and of itself has just killed it dead. Okay, like it's just not gonna recover from that. Like they can like do whatever they want, but in a lot of ways, the PS5 in and of itself was never relevant or competitive, and replacing it with the PS6, like it just games take too long, I think, to justify releasing new consoles at this point. Like I really think consoles should be made to last like 10 to 12 years at this point. Like but like the industry isn't going to do it cuz they need to keep people like on like the hamster wheel of buying new consoles. Like they would sell you new hardware like every year or two if they could. The problem is that like people have demonstrated that they're not going to do that. You're not going to see PlayStation owners upgrade from a PS5 to a PS5 Pro. It's just not going to happen. But it has happened with the Switch 1 to the Switch 2. It's something that I feel like people haven't talked about or addressed, and it's becoming a bit of a problem, I think, for the masses. I think people just aren't accepting how anxious like Sony must be right now about how they've killed all their credibility and how reliant the entire gaming industry is on the success of Grand Theft Auto 6. And this is something that people will try and tell you is that Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to be the best-selling game ever, and that it's going to outperform everything on the Switch 2, and it's going to be this industry-defining thing. Like, what about the rest of the games that are coming out this year? Okay, like what else is coming out? And the simple fact of the matter is, like, Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to be the last time ever, I think, that we get a PlayStation and Xbox game that is going to carry the entire consoles. Like, it's going to take too long for a sequel to come out, and by that point, Rockstar will be, like, have bent the knee to Nintendo and have, like, made sure that it's launching day and date, like everybody else has been doing. Like, it doesn't matter how well Grand Theft Auto 6 sells. It's not going to salvage the Western video game industry, and it's not going to save PlayStation, and it's certainly not going to destroy Nintendo. Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to be the best-selling game this year, but when you look at the rest of the top 10 list, you're going to be seeing a lot of Switch 2 games. Like, that's just the reality of where we're at right now, is that there is no amount of units that Grand Theft Auto can sell that will destroy Nintendo. And that is something that people are just going to have to come to terms with.